Well, good morning. So happy to be with you guys today. There is a growing sense of fear and anxiety among Christians in the West. With the rise and influence of secularism and post-Christian culture, the hemorrhaging of the people from the church, the loss of cultural influence in the public square, all of these and more have pushed us into a state of anxiety, fear, and self-preservation. And a lot of people, if they were to describe what it feels like to be a Christian in 2022, are the words of REM. It's the end of the world as we know it, right? A common framework I think a lot of us have is that what we're experiencing is new, right? In my conversations, it seems as though many people think that the moment that we are in is unprecedented. And it's the worst the world has ever been. And that's kind of a common framework and motif, that it's the worst the world has ever been. Now, that's a very nearsighted view of history. Because if you do any amount of research, you realize that all that we're experiencing is not new, and it is surely not as worse as it's ever been. I think a lot of people's framework is they think back in history, like the 1200s or something, and that everybody was just Christians back then, right? Everyone loved Jesus and worshiped him and were Christians. The only problem with that is reality, right? If we go back and look, that's not been the case. What we've seen throughout time is not that everyone was once a Christian and as time has progressed, we've slowly declined towards, secularism, but it's actually been something like this, waves all throughout history of moments where God has broken through and people have come to know him and have a relationship with him, and then seasons where people have ran from God, right? So it's like revivals and running, all throughout history, we've seen this to be the case. And so, rather, what history seems to be like is more akin to tides, returning to God and running from God all throughout history. And so there's a common phrase, and it's this: it's always darkest before what? The dawn. And so what if in this moment we find ourselves is not a moment of mourning, but a moment of preparation? What if in the receding of the church, it's actually gaining momentum for a tide of renewal? What if the only way something new could be born is first for something dead to be removed? What if we would not only look at where we are currently, but we would lift our eyes to see the horizon of possibility? What if only after we have drank from an empty well of secularism would we realize our deep need for God? The world secularism system promises, but fails to deliver on its promises. Mark Sayers, a pastor and commentator, says this: it is not just at the macro level that the secular myth of progress is being challenged. Our private worlds are in crisis too. We see the rise of anxiety and mental health disorders, falling IQ levels, epidemic loneliness and social disconnection, widespread online bullying, and the persistence of discrimination, bigotry, and hatred. Addictions to drugs, food, technology, gambling, and relationships are widespread. Obesity is rising, becoming a full-blown health issue. In the West, poor mental health is now normative among emerging generations, and life expectancy in the West's two most powerful nations, the US and the UK, has fallen for the last 3 years running. I have nothing but good news for you this morning. We have been captivated by the secular vision of the good life. Hook, line, and sinker. But I have one question, and it's this: how is it working for us? Do we have any more sense of deep transcendent peace and joy and life, or are we still looking and longing for something more? I would contend secularism is not working very well at all. You see, despite all of our progress, innovations, and advancements, the deep longings of the soul still go unsatisfied. But I have good news for you this morning, and it's this: there's movement in the margins. Every great move of God first begins in the margins. We see throughout history it's like this. A wave of Christianity kind of comes through. People come to faith and believe in Jesus. Then as time goes on, that wave kind of recedes back, and what's left is a remnant, a small group of faithful people committed to the way of Jesus. And it is those people where God begins to stir and to move, and the wave comes rushing back in through those faithful remnant. We've seen this all throughout history. Some of my favorite moments in history like this, the Azusa Street revivals, the revival in the Hebrides, the beloved community during the Civil Rights Movement, the Jesus Movement, the Toronto Blessing, all of these were born in the margins. In an unlikely place with unlikely people, God began to stir. And as we look back on these divine moments in history, it is clear to us that God's hand was at work. But at the time, each of them just seemed like beautiful coincidences, right? At the moment as they're happening, people did not realize the move of God they were in until only looking back later. I believe, as we will look back on this moment in time, it will be clear that God is setting himself apart, a remnant, to bring about his purposes. And today, in Esther, we're going to see the same thing. As I mentioned last week, Esther is an invitation to see God at work. Commentator Michael Fox says this: when we scrutinize the text of Esther for traces of God's activity, we're doing what the author has made us do. The author would have us to probe the events we witness in our own lives in the same way. He is teaching a theology of possibility, the willingness to face history with an openness to the possibility of divine providence, even when history seems to weigh against its likelihood. In this way, the book offers a stance of profound faith. So today, brothers and sisters, through the book of Esther, we're going to endeavor to learn a theology of possibility. And it all begins with an unlikely opportunity. Chapter 2 opens up saying this: later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants promised, "Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all of these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who's in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." The advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. So if you were here last week, if you weren't, you missed out. But if you were here last week, we know Xerxes to be an interesting character, right? Last week, he got really drunk, made a really inappropriate request. His wife refused for clear and obvious reasons, and he decided to have her at the least banished, at the most executed, right? This kind of lets you in on this guy's psyche, right? He's not very stable. You don't want to really be around this guy. So after his anger has subsided, the text tells us, and he sobered up, he realized what he had done. Now the text here gives us some insight that Xerxes had some regret. Joyce Baldwin, another commentator, says this: that Xerxes remembered Vashti implies some uneasiness about the whole incident, but the king was trapped by his own legislation decreed against her. Because of Xerxes' decision, he has now made his bed, and he has to lie in it. An important thing to take note of here is that he's decreed this against Vashti, meaning he has actually made it a law. He's legislated his wife's fate. And so, according to the Medes and Persian law, there's no undoing of that. Now, it seems like really random and like, thanks for that information. I have no idea what I'm going to do with that. But it's going to come to be a really important part later in the story. The biblical authors don't just put things in there because they need to meet a word count and they're writing a paper for something, you know? They put things in there with intentionality that'll serve a purpose later. All throughout the scriptures, there's always Easter eggs, and this is an Easter egg foreshadowing the things that will come. Now, the next thing, I want to talk a little bit about Xerxes for a brief moment. Even him, as erratic, childish, and what the commentator last week said, slothful thinking, which is not as the sharpest tool in the shed, he finds himself waking up with regret. You see, in a moment, with heated passion and anger, fueled by alcohol, he made a terrible decision, and he realizes that. Some of you have had a similar experience, in the heat of the moment, in the heat of anger, you said something, you did something, right? And it was only after the anger subsided or after sobriety had come into your mind that you realized the error of your ways. That feeling is what Xerxes is feeling. Now, what would be a good thing to do is to sit in that, regret for a moment. And it's important, here's why. One of the things that we love to do is distract ourselves into oblivion, right? We love to just, when we start thinking about a decision that we made that we're not comfortable with, or the kind of person we're becoming that we never thought we'd become, we begin to distract ourselves into oblivion because we don't like thinking those kinds of thoughts. And the king's helpers, his servants, want to do the same thing. They want to just shift his mind towards something new. But an important part of learning from our mistakes, learning from the error of our ways, is to sit in the reality of the consequences of those decisions. Now, Xerxes has people around him who won't allow him to do that. I mean, had Xerxes really sat in that decision, maybe, just maybe, there'd be a change of heart, a repentance of his ways. But because he has people around him who want to just push him to move on quickly, they shift his focus to something else. They distract him, saying, King, don't worry about Vashti. Here's what we'll do. Here's the plan. And the idea is essentially, in a modern translation of a modern idea of this would be like Miss Persia, okay? They're going to do a beauty pageant. All the prettiest ladies in all of Persia are going to come before the king. Now, this isn't like our Miss America or something like that they're like voluntarily doing this and, anything of that nature. This is like forced, right? They see a pretty lady in the streets, she's coming to come before the king. And so there's this kind of competition of sorts for who will become queen next. They're all going to gather all the single women of Persia, and the king will choose from there who he wants to be his bride. It is like a beauty pageant, if you will, a Miss Persia, if you will. Now, granted, they didn't have any choice in the matter, but this will serve as the backdrop for the story that's about to unfold. Now, an important note. This story is starting like a really bad telenovela. Would you agree? Like, this is just, this is an absurdity. And the author is writing this way with some intent. But it's important to know that this was not how queens were chosen in the ancient world. Like, this wasn't just like par for the course, ancient how it worked. Let's just do a beauty pageant, right? It's absurd even in its time that this is happening. The way that queens were often chose was for political power, right? There'd be some sort of a political motivation behind it, or a family of royal bloodline of things of that nature. Like marriages in the ancient days served political purposes. This seems to be really strange and off-putting from all of that, how incredibly rare that this is. And so as we journey through this story, it's important to note that us seeing God's hands does not serve as us signing responsibility or agency to God that the author does not attribute to him. So here's what I'm saying clearly. This that's happening right here is strange and peculiar, and the story of Esther is inviting us to see God's hand in it. What I don't want us to do is say, God had Xerxes get drunk and depose Vashti, also that Esther could rise to prominence. That would be called something called meticulous providence, right? That God is orchestrating every single step. I do not think that's what the biblical authors are inviting us into here, but rather seeing an overall way that God works through influence. So not that every single decision is being made by God, through some sort of way of himself, but that God is subtly influencing the characters in the moments they find themselves, in the situations they find themselves in, to bring about the greatest good. Right? There's a certain wing of the church who believes in something called meticulous providence, meaning that every single decision, down to the very details, is orchestrated and executed by God so that everything that happens is God's will. This is not the theology that we hold here at Zion. I disagree with this framework for a multitude of reasons, but mainly and primarily, the framework lends itself to the reality, if God is responsible for every decision, then by extension, he's responsible for evil. Right? If God's in every single decision, then ultimately he's accountable for the evil that comes from it. And I think you have to do a lot of verbal gymnastics to get around that reality. And so the framework that I want us to have is when looking at situations, not that God is responsible for them, but that he's working through them. That despite the circumstances and situations that present themselves, those things aren't from God. God is working through them. An example, when something really bad happens, like someone gets a cancer diagnosis, what the Christian community wants to say is like, oh, God has a plan, don't worry about this, God's in this, whatever. Now it sounds like you did them a favor, like, oh, I could have peace about this. But what you're actually saying with that language is that God is responsible for giving you cancer. That's a really hard thing to say, and a really, I think, deeply unbiblical thing to say. And so it's not that in a situation like that, because let's say, because of the diagnosis, you repair some relationships with your family and see, God did this so that you'd have better relationships with your family. It's like, no, I think that's bad theology, right? It's like, I'm glad that worked in that way and that God worked in that manner, but it does not mean that he was the one responsible for sending the cancer. Does that make sense? I believe that the enemy's motives are clear in John 10, to steal, kill, and destroy, and all evil comes from him. But one of the things God loves to do is take the very things that the enemy meant to destroy and flip them on its head and bring good out of them, i.e. the example of Joseph. Right? Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, and the enemy meant for that to ruin him. The evil, the wickedness in his brothers' hearts meant that to be his end and his demise. But when Joseph sees his brothers again, you know what he tells them? He says, what you meant for evil, God meant for my good. Through it all, God divinely orchestrated, influenced, worked in the terrible situation Joseph found himself in to bring about the most good. And this is how I want us to view and think about the story of Esther. And so in this situation, God's not responsible for what took place with Vashti in the following beauty pageant, but God will use these circumstances to bring about something good. The text goes on. Now there in the citadel of Susa, a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. So here is the first time we're introduced to the two main characters, the two protagonists in the story, Mordecai and Esther. All of chapter 1 kind of served as a backdrop for here's all that's happening, and even part of chapter 2, and now we're getting into the two main characters of the story. Now there's two images I want you to have in your mind when we think about Mordecai and Esther. Mordecai is a rock, and Esther is a tree, and I'll explain in a moment. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I did not say the rock. I don't want you thinking of Mordecai and thinking of Dwayne Johnson. A rock, a picture of stability and firmness. And Esther is going to be this image of growth. Let's first talk about Mordecai, the rock. Mordecai, the name is a variation from the Babylonian god Marduk. And so we see even in his name, Mordecai has taken a Babylonian name because he's been immersed in that kind of culture. And we'll see that as the story progresses on, Mordecai becomes a source of stability for the story. If there's any character that we could find that displays signs of moral clarity, it's that of Mordecai. Mordecai is wise. All throughout the story, we see Mordecai operate with wisdom. His ability to have foresight into situations, strategically deploy conversations, navigate with political savvy, and understand how to play up to the king's ego are all example of how Mordecai uses wisdom. Also, Mordecai is loyal. Mordecai is presented with plenty of opportunities to allow things just to play out, but instead, he has integrity and honors and protects the people that have been entrusted to his care. And we see that particularly in the life of King Xerxes here at the later of the story and with Esther often. Mordecai is honest. Mordecai is not manipulative in the story. He's almost honest to a fault. He always tells the truth, and we will see this throughout the story. Mordecai is also others-focused. Commentator Michael Fox says of him this: he rises in rank and power without evident effort towards those goals. The accrue to him as incidental rewards for his devotion to the king and his people. We also see that Mordecai is a leader. Mordecai becomes a picture of a diaspora leader, somebody who leads well when they are not in power. How does one lead when they're not a prince, prophet, or priest? By leveraging the influence they do have for the greater good. In the story, Mordecai functions as a wise sage to guide the main protagonist, Esther, through her story with values and principles. And so he's a mentor voice for Esther to help her navigate some of the complex situations she finds herself in. Mordecai is a mentor in the story. And all of our favorite stories have mentors in them. Star Wars fans, right, the original trilogy, Yoda served as this sage to help Luke find the Force or whatever it is, right? Or tap into it. I don't know. I'm probably using the wrong language. Star Wars fans are going to be pissed at me. But you get the idea, is all of our favorite stories about heroes becoming their own have mentors in it. And I think the same is true in life. If you're banking on just your own ability to navigate through life, you will not get very far. But God always strategically places mentors along your journey. The only question is, will you heed their counsel or not? Will you listen to these mentors or not? I thank God for all the incredible men and women God has strategically placed in my life to help mentor me, to help me think well about decisions, to help me walk through the complexities and hard things of life. And these mentors serve as rocks. When life feels unstable and uncertain and chaotic, you can lean on these individuals to help give you a sense of stability and clarity. They help you kind of rise above the chaotic storms of life and see the horizon just beyond. And I'm so thankful for these kind of mentors. All of us need them at every stage in life. And Mordecai is Esther's. And let's talk about Esther. The image in your mind I want you to have is a tree. While Mordecai is a picture of stability, Esther is a picture of growth and change. We will see Esther's journey progress as she moves towards her calling. Michael Fox points out this progression. In the beginning of the story, she starts in a posture of passivity. Then, as the story progresses, she moves towards activity, and as the story ends, she ends in authority. And this is kind of the track that we see her run along, from passivity to activity to authority. We are meant to find a similar journey in ourselves in the story of Esther. When we find her, she's a young woman. For her to be an unmarried virgin in the ancient world means she is likely an early teenager. And as we follow Esther's journey, the author doesn't give us insight into her thought life, but only a description of her actions. Now, I want to be clear about something. Esther is not for us a moral picture of how young women are to live in the modern world, right? There are good things about Esther, but we're not to take all of her actions hook, line, and sinker. The biblical authors don't want us to do that. And so what we don't want to do is be like, hey, young ladies, look at Esther. See how she did things, because she did things not the best way all the time. But what we do want to do is be able to learn from Esther some of the good things that she did and also learn from her mistakes as well. And so as we find her, Esther is entirely at the will and whim of others, whether it be Mordecai, Haggai here shortly, or Xerxes. Her life is governed by all these powerful men. Michael Fox says this: the author sees to convey the insignificance of her will and mind at this stage. Esther is putty, not because of any personality flaw, but because of the age and situation. Nothing has ever challenged her to be anything more. And so as we find Esther, she's a young, impressionable woman, thrust into an impossible situation, trying to navigate those waters. And so for us, we got to have some sympathy and empathy towards her for the decisions and sometimes the mistakes that she makes, and also try to understand her reasoning behind those decisions. Again, not that everything that she makes is an endorsement by God, but it's simply just an understanding of the place in which she finds herself. But she's a young person trying to navigate a really complex world. And we'll get into that here in a moment. Now, one of the really important things about Esther is she's the only character who has two names in the story. It gives her Hebrew name, Hadassah, and her Babylonian name, which is Esther. Karen Jobes, commentator, says this: Esther is the only person in the story with two names. Leland Ryken interprets this as the author's way of depicting Esther as a young woman trying to live in two worlds: the Jewish world, which she was raised in, and the opulent world of the Persian court into which she was thrust. For us, Esther functions as a picture of how somebody lives between the two worlds, the world of their morality and their character and the world in which they find themselves in. And this is a picture for us as the church, because we are also diaspora people. We are people of a different nation, learning how to live under the rule and reign of other empires and kingdoms. We also discover here in this passage that Esther is an orphan, and Mordecai is her uncle and has taken her in to raise her as his daughter. And the last information that we get here is that she's beautiful. Although as characters they are far from perfect, we see that as the story unfolds, God uses both Mordecai and Esther to bring forth goodness. One of my favorite things about the book is that we get a real and honest picture of our heroes. That they're not black and white, that they're complicated and complex. We want black and white heroes. We want the people who always do the right thing, who always have the right way of going about things. We want our heroes to be without fault. But as the book of Esther shows, this is not the case. Because they are flawed doesn't mean they can't be used or we can't learn something well from how they lived in a complex world. The story goes on, verse 8. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Hegai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Hegai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with beauty treatments, and special food. He assigned to her 7 female servants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Before a young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments and prescribed the women 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. This is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go there, and in the morning she would return to another part of the harem in the care of Shashgaz. Good luck with that one. The king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. So, we see in the story that Esther is one of these women taken. She's one of the ones selected for Miss Persia, if you will. And so she's brought there, and most Bible scholars estimate that there was around 500 to 1,500 women selected for this, right? You can imagine how insane that would be. And all of them were required to do a year's worth of beauty treatments. Now, there's all sorts of conjecture about what that means. None of us really know. But if you think you take a long time to get ready, a year, right? And then 6 months of bathing in oils and perfumes, right? And so this is an extensive process that they have to go through. And so she finds herself in a sea of other young, beautiful women trying to compete for the king's heart. Now, here we discover that she immediately finds favor with this guy, Hegai. That Hegai takes a liking to her. That she starts getting perks because of it. So one is she has 7 assistants assigned to her, right? To do her bidding, I guess. I mean, I'm not too sure what all she's doing, but she's got 7 assistants to help her with whatever she is that she needs to do. She's given the best room. Of all these other women, she's given the one with the ocean view or whatever. She's also given the best portions of food and stuff of that nature. She's instantly gaining favor with this guy Hegai who's entrusted to see over them. Michael Fox again says this: Esther pleases Hegai and gains or takes kindness or favor. The Hebrew word here is hesed. This idiom, only found in Esther, holds the suggestion of activeness in gaining rather than, as the usual idiom has it, finding kindness. Gaining kindness is something she is doing rather than something being done to her. So in all of this, one way of viewing this is that Esther just shows up and Hagai's oh, she's the one, and starts giving her favor. But that's not exactly what the text is saying here with this word. What the text is actually saying is this combination. It's both Esther doing things to gain favor with Hegai and also favor coming from elsewhere. It is this both and situation happening as Esther is finding favor. It is both effort and grace at work here that is bringing Esther favor in her situation. So, for example, to bring this to the contemporary world, oftentimes we long for God's favor, and sometimes, or blessing. And sometimes we think this means just pray and do nothing, and this is how we receive favor from God, right? So for example, you're on a job search. You're looking for a job. Some people think like, well, just pray and a job's going to show up. That's not how it works, right? It's like it's both you praying that God would bring you a good job, and then you do what? You apply. You show up to interviews. No one's just going to, rarely ever, someone's going to knock at your door and say, hey, we have this 6-figure job. We haven't been able to find anyone to take it. Do you want it? No, it is this combination of both and. It is both grace that Esther's just receiving these different things and also favor. I mean, I don't know exactly what she's doing to curry that favor. Maybe she like cleans her plates when she's done or has the neatest and tidiest room. I'm not sure. But whatever it is that she's doing, she's currying favor with Haggai. She's beginning to understand and learn how the political world works where she's living. And she's learning how to navigate that with wisdom. Now, one of the ways she learns how to navigate that system well is to not reveal her identity. Now, it seems really peculiar that Mordecai would instruct her with this, like, hey, don't tell anybody what you're from or where you're from or that you're a Jew. It seems weird that Mordecai would give her that kind of instruction. But Mordecai senses something stirring amongst the people. And this is where we see Mordecai walking in wisdom, as he senses some sort of anti-Semitism rising up in the Persian government that will soon come to its fruition later on. And so this will serve to be great wisdom as the story progresses. And also, we see that Mordecai is deeply concerned about Esther. That every single day after work, he's going into the court seeing if he can hear word about what's happened. Has she gone to the king yet? Does he like her? Is she doing okay? What's happening? We see Mordecai's deep concern for her. Now, lastly, this beauty regimen was incredibly extensive and took a long time for them to complete. And so to be clear, again, this isn't like a Miss America pageant. What is clear here from the text is there's a lot of sexual overtones to what's happening here. To give an example, myrrh was like sexy perfume of the old days. You know what I'm saying? It's like you put that on when it was time, fill in the blanks. So they would do this kind of a thing to like prepare the women to see the king. Now, what's important that we understand that what's happening here is it's not like Miss America. They just come out and do the thing and then twirl the baton, sing a song, and then walk off the stage, and he's like, winner. What's happening here is they're going into the king's quarters. Now, the text tells us that whoever pleased him the most would be the one who he would choose. They're not going back there and playing badminton and Monopoly. They're doing something else. I will let you exegete the rest. But that's what's happening here, as there's a very much performative aspect to what's happening here. And this is why the biblical authors are very hesitant to like give their blessing on Esther because of this action in particular, and among others, particularly later in the story. But this is one of them. Because for the biblical author's framework, it's not that like, oh, she's just in a tough situation, what should you do? Because the counterpart to Esther is Daniel. And we see that in Daniel, Daniel never compromises, even if it costs him his life, i.e. the lion's den, right? And so Esther, on the other hand, does compromise. Now, the biblical authors aren't condemning her for it, nor are they praising her for it. They're just simply describing what it is that takes place. And I think we gather from a biblical ethic that the decision that she made wasn't the best according to the way of Jesus, but it is the decision that she made. Now next, verse 15. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now when the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials, and he proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with liberality. So one of the things that we notice here is Esther's ability to glean wisdom from those around her, i.e. she takes Mordecai's wisdom to conceal her identity, and she takes Haggai's advice and what she should bring with her to her visit with the king. Now, Michael Fox again says this: the mass detail in the description of the harem life reveals an oppressively regulated atmosphere, total dependence on the chief eunuch and on the regimen devoted to the preparation for someone else's pleasure. Here's the key line. Promotion depends on pleasing those in charge. This is what Esther comes to understand. that the way that she's going to advance, the way that she's going to survive, the way she's going to make it through is learning how to please those in charge. Again, not a commentary on this was the right way to do things, but rather this is just the way that things unfolded for her. Next, we find out that she becomes queen. And so it's easy for us to like go in Bible study mode and be like, and then Esther became queen, and she did this thing over there, and then they had a party, whatever, move on. But I want you to think about this story for a moment. She loses her parents at an incredibly young age, whatever age that may be, and is forced to move in with her cousin Mordecai, who is a government official who works for the government, etc. And so she's growing up her whole life trying to discern and discover her identity, now as a young woman without a mother and without a father, but is being raised by a cousin. And in all of this, by happen chance, she's selected by the king to enter in this beauty pageant. And she walks into a room with approximately 1,500 other young women, right? Now, I don't know what kind of self-confidence you have, right? But if I was in sort of any competition with 1,500 other men, right, I'm not thinking I'm the guy, right? I'm not walking in there thinking, all these jokers, you know? There's no way. I mean, maybe bottom third, maybe I'm somewhere floating in there on a good day, right? But it's like, I'm not thinking I'm going to take over. And she probably felt the same way. And then years pass, right? The thing is probably 4 years between when this happened and probably when Esther became, based on the king being in his 7th year of reign. 4 years pass of her just like waiting for her turn. And these other women come back, no, it's not me, no, it's not me, right? Up to 1,000. The Bible scholars believe that he was having a new woman come to him every single day, right? So I don't know what you're thinking your odds are on this, but it's probably not looking good, right? And she, of all these other women, is chosen. Now, what the text tells us is like she didn't take anything additionally with her other than what Haggai had told her to. So she knows that Haggai knows the king really well, and she's like, does he like purple dresses? Does he like pink? Whatever it is, right? And so she gets that information, and she goes in to be with the king. Now, we see that Esther goes from orphan to queen. She goes from displaced minority to a prominent position in power like that, right? In a moment's time, from the one night with the king, she gets to become queen. That's a pretty insane thing. And so from this moment, she's a beautiful young woman trying to learn how to live in two worlds. And the next moment, right, she's learning to shoulder the responsibility and authority over a nation. As an unlikely young woman placed in unusual circumstances rises to unprecedented power. It is here we're to see the influence of the Lord, guiding his hand to bring her into that position. Now, the story goes on. When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai told her to do. For she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of Annals in the presence of the king. So, this seems like a really weird derailment from the story. Like Esther becomes queen, and like in the king's fashion, what does he do? Throws another party. But that's what happens. He throws another party, and then it just like jumps to this moment with Mordecai. And it seems random and off like not in the line of the story. But this moment's going to set the backdrop for something that's going to happen earlier. One of the things that Esther is going to continue to do, guys, is reverse things. Something's going to happen, and you'll realize something that happened earlier set forward in motion some events that will impact the future deeply later. And so as all this stuff is happening, I want you to tuck this in the back of your mind, because as we progress in the story, you're going to see how important this moment really is. So what happens here is we find Mordecai at the king's gate. Like, what the heck does that mean? What's even happening here? So what the king would do, this was not a democracy. This was a dictatorship. So it's important that you understand that. It's not like the king was voted in the last term elections, right? He's a guy with all authority and all power. When somebody has that kind of power, it is very common, if not likely, that somebody seeks to seize that power by force. Would you agree? So it is not uncommon for people to want to assassinate the king, because if you can assassinate him, you can overthrow him, you could take his power. So what the king would do is he had all these officials, these government officials who worked for him. But what he'd also do is he'd employ essentially spies, think CIA operatives, right, to be amongst those officials who report directly back to him, whose allegiance is only to him, not in the bureaucratic system. Mordecai is one of these spies. This is one of his jobs. And so his job is to be like, what you talking about over here, you know? And then he'd go report that to the king. Now, Mordecai is sitting there hanging out, and he overhears two guys, Bigthana and Teresh, again, really good baby names, plotting to kill the king. And so what Mordecai does is it was his job normally to go and tell the king directly. But what Mordecai does instead is really wise. He tells Esther to tell the king. Why? Because he wants Esther to build trust and favor with the king. That if she were to expose a plot like this, he knows that he could trust her. Right? Now, Mordecai, had he been bent and crooked, be like, Xerxes is the worst. You know, just let the plan unfold, don't say nothing. But he had integrity. And even though he may not like Xerxes, even though he probably doesn't agree with all the things that he does, he still chooses to honor and respect the position that he's in by holding integrity to the job that he has. And so he tells the truth, and he reveals what happens. And so this unfolds. So Adele Berlin, one of my other famous commentators, says this: the action establishes Esther as a reliable source of information for the king, something that will become important later in the story. And so after the investigations are found out, these men are felt guilty, and they are executed in a particularly brutal way, which is impalement. This will also serve to see as a foreshadowing of things to come in the future. Now, we're winding down here, we're ending here. Now, when we read this story, it's easy for us to chalk this all up as luck, happen chance, or simply right place, right person, right time. But what Esther is trying to teach us is a theology of possibility, meaning the author wants us to see God at work in the seemingly ordinary and obscure moments of life. One of my favorite quotes of all time. Paula D'Arcy says this: God comes to us disguised as our own life. God comes to us disguised as our own life. I have found in my own journey of following Jesus that there is a divine dance in which I find myself at the center of. There's this divine dance of providence and action. You see, for many of us, we lean to one extreme. Either God is behind every flat tire and stubbed toe, or he stands aloof and distant from the world he made with cold indifference. But I, along with the author of Esther, invite you to a different reality, that of a theology of possibility. That maybe, just maybe, God stands in the middle of the chaos and wonder of our lives, whispering into the hearts of men as we move through life. That there are obviously Red Sea moments of life, which are clear and undeniable that it was God moving. But most of life are not those ways. Most of life is far more mysterious. And so what if our lives are lived in the divine dance of providence and action? What if it is both us and God partnering together to write the story of our lives? Right now, I want to invite you to think about your journey. I want you to notice themes or seams in your life that God might be weaving together. I want us to create some space right now where we ask the Spirit what he is up to in our lives. And so as a community, we're going to enter into a time of response now. You know, it's easy to hear the story like Esther and be kind of unsure to what to do with that, you know? Like when Miss New Mexico comes around, am I supposed to apply? Or, you know, what exactly does God want me to do with a story like this? But I believe it's this. I believe it's to consider your own life. That for what these characters felt like happen chance or obscurity or luck or whatever, they began to see that as favor. And the positions they found themselves in, they didn't stumble into by some chance, but that God had actually appointed them to those places. And that God has them there to serve a purpose, to bring about goodness, to, as Mordecai did, leverage the influence he has to bring forward the good. And I want you to consider your story. Common themes and seams in your life that have brought you to where you are today. And how the Spirit might be inviting you to partner with him and what he's doing in the world. So I'm going to ask you to stand. And we're going to enter into a time of worship. I have a sense this morning that there are somebody or some people questioning their purpose. That when you consider your own life, it seems chaotic and messy, and you're not sure what you're quote-unquote called to do, where you're called to go, who you're called to speak to, what it is all of this means. And you read the story of Esther, and maybe you get a little jealous because it seems like for her it's pretty clear, and for Mordecai it's pretty clear, but for you it's not. And I think the invitation from the Spirit for you this morning is to realize that it's happening right now. That it's only later on in life when you look back on this season, when you see God's hand leading and guiding you, that right now just feels like chaos. But until you get to that place where you can look back and see that, the Spirit's inviting you to come and to seek his face, to come and to ask him what he's doing right now. So if that's you, we're going to have some people up here ready to pray that want to pray with you. I also get a sense that there's some people in the room this morning that have a lot of stress, that there's a weighty decision. There's a lot of things happening, and a lot of fear that you've had has been about making the wrong decision, doing the wrong thing, going down the wrong path. And this morning you're needing wisdom, you're needing guidance. If that's you, we would love to pray with you and ask for God's discernment in that. Lastly, I feel for those, God has been burdening you, calling you towards something. And it's been consistent. It's been unrelenting. And you keep running from it. Because you're afraid, because you're unsure of what the future might look like, because you're not even sure exactly what it's going to look like. But you feel this call, this stirring in you. And I believe this morning the Lord wants to impart courage into your heart, to step into all the wonderful things that he has planned for you, to step into all the wonderful things that he wants to bring about through your life. And if that's you, it would be our joy to pray with you. And if there's anything else going on, if you're like, dude, you're in left field, man, I'm nowhere in that place, but I need prayer, we would love to just minister and pray with you. And so we're just going to enter into a time of worship. And I just want to ask you, as you worship, reflect on your own story. Ask the Spirit to highlight moments where God has been faithful to you, and offer up praise and thanksgiving for the moments that he's given you. Divine moments in your own story where it was clear that God was meeting with you. And maybe right here, right now is one of those moments that he's meeting with you. He's speaking to you. Brothers and sisters, let us worship the Lord.